Richard Janda is currently visiting scholar in French and Italian at Indiana University, but his teaching spans 13 universities in 9 US states, plus lectures in 6 other countries. He didn't give me the list. A graduate of Stanford University and UCLA, he specializes in the diachrony and synchrony of phonology, morphology, and morphosyntax, mainly in Germanic and Romance languages, but recently has increasingly focused on issues in the history of linguistics. Janda has authored or co-edited over 75 publications, the best known probably being the 2 volumes of the Blackwell Handbook of Historical Linguistics in 2003 and 2020. And now, Morris and the Matrix. Halle rules.
All right. Morris Halle was actually born as Morris Pinkowitz, and that's the Yiddish version, Pinkowitz. The Latvian version, he was born in Latvia. He just escaped the Russian takeover, and then the Nazis came in. He died in Cambridge, a beloved figure in 2018. His sketch in Word is essentially a program for phonology. It was before Macaulay had a program for logic, which was about syntax and semantics. But everything basically is prefigured for the sound pattern of English to come and beyond. It focuses this article on simplicity criteria, segments as feature complexes, lexical underspecification, rules and rule ordering, as these relate to dialect differences, language acquisition, and linguistic change. Yes, economy and explanatory power galore glimmer invitingly on the dawn-like horizon. It's morning in phonology. And there was a great development after that. I would point out, though, that Claude Debussy said that Wagner's music was a sunset that people had mistaken for a sunrise. So people can have different ideas about sunrise. I am not kidding about the matrices and the rules. I counted them. There are 45 matrices with more than one feature. 8 of them have only 2, so maybe should be taken up. But 37 have 3 or more features. And Halle has 46 rules. Sometimes he talks about the same rule or the same matrix over and over again. But he does indeed address and master the matrix, and he regulates the rules. And his watchword is the notation is the theory. He doesn't say this explicitly, which also, of course, implies that the theory is the notation. But this was something that was taught to me, and you read his article and you just almost can't believe how much he's focused on counting and seeing whether one description is longer than the other one. I'll quote Chomsky along the same way. But I think you have to say that Halle is guilty of symbolismolatry. There's apparently not an ancient Greek word, symbolismos, but modern Greek symbolismos is either symbolism or a notation, and Halle worships the notation. So Chomsky has a preface to syntactic structures where he talks about rigorous formalization and precisely constructed models, and the part that he really focuses on that gets quoted, by pushing a precise but inadequate formulation to an unacceptable conclusion, we can often expose the exact source of this inadequacy and consequently gain a deeper understanding of the linguistic data. More positively, a formalized theory may automatically provide solutions for many problems other than those for which it was explicitly designed. Obscure and intuition-bound notions can neither lead to absurd conclusions nor provide new and correct conclusions, and hence they fail to be useful in those 2 respects. Of course, the implication is that rigorously stating a proposed theory and applying it strictly to linguistic material may yield unacceptable conclusions which persist. And some linguists would perhaps meanly apply this to parts of Chomsky and Halle's sound pattern of English. And there's a real issue here. I'm happy to invoke Jim Macaulay, who in his paper on unsyntax, following up on something he had already said in 1973, attacked people who overrate formalism. He said, a formalism should say what you say it does. It shouldn't matter that it's, for example, in black and white on a 2-dimensional page. But yet there are formalisms that depend on the thing being two-dimensional and the lines hooking up in certain ways. So he says, heed the sagacious advice of H. Dumpty, who is Humpty Dumpty, who in Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass says, a word means what I make it do and nothing more. And if I have to make it do more, I pay it. So Macaulay is saying, define your notation. Don't do what Chomsky does. So what Chomsky and Halle do is they say, we have intuitions. They're somewhat unformalized. Formalize them, put them in the notation, and then believe the notation. And when you don't have intuitions, the notation will tell you what to do. So this is great. You will be able to extend your intuitions. Of course, when they go beyond your intuitions, you don't know where you're being led. So some preliminary housekeeping. Unfortunately for our word focus here, Halle, less than 2 years later, revised his paper, and it appeared in Fodor and Katz, The Structure of Language. They edited this volume, which has a lot of important generative papers. It has Chomsky's Current Issues in Linguistic Theory in one of its 8 versions, with discussion of structuralist phonemics. And Halle did really change the article. He added a footnote. He took away 3 other footnotes. There are at least 300 new words of text. He carried over some typos from the Word version where he misquoted William Dwight Whitney. But unfortunately, then the K and F, the Katz and Fodor version, gets cited more because it's this anthology of important works. And you would have to go get Word by itself. I don't know if your library is the same as Indiana's, but you have to go to the auxiliary facility to get the journal. But Fodor and Katz is still on some of the stack shelves. So before he was reprinted, already Halle was saying he's looking at consequences of abstract conditions on the form of phonological descriptions and the application of a proposed simplicity measure. So in brief, the long and short of it is, shorter is better and less is more. Fewer features, that's better. So certain formulations are chosen from among several alternatives, and among the whipping boys are post-Bloomfieldian American structuralist approaches. The bad thing about them is they use segments as integral wholes. They don't break them down into feature complex, into matrices. They use descriptive language, and they didn't want to be judged on the number of words in their descriptions. They were thinking about something conceptual, but Halle wants to do it notationally. The plausibility and intrinsic appeal of the description selected will provide the preliminary justification, not just for the proposed simplicity criterion, but also for the theory of generative grammar, of which the criterion is an integral part. All right, so very quickly, the 12 parts of his paper. He had to redo everything in Fodor and Katz. He changes from Hindu Arabic numerals to Roman numerals for the parts. First, he argues for breaking down segments into a matrix of phonological features. These are Jacobsonian features. If you aren't familiar with those, they're a little bit hard to sort out. And rather than translate them, I will give some examples at the end, but not use them most of the way through here. This approach of using matrices allows intuitively simpler rules with fewer symbols. You say a few features in the input, you change the input just with a symbol or two. You have an environment in symbols, and this is then what you can count. And you can say that intuitively, so this comes in, intuitively simpler rules have fewer symbols. I once believed in this. Maybe this is not the zeal of the converted, but the deconverted, I can remember spending a very long time trying to save 2 or 3 features in a rule, and I'll give an example later of where I did this. But Halle is really into it. Rule ordering is good because it allows simplification of individual rules. That's where the Sanskrit with the typos comes in from Whitney. If you simplify the rules, you can do that straight off, but you can also gain simplification by rule ordering. There is lexical underspecification in part 3. Redundancy rules, he doesn't always call them that, but they fill in redundant information in a segmental matrix, so you can then have fewer features in the representations of morphemes. You can also have redundancies that are based on combinations of sounds. A famous example in English, if you tell someone that you have a word that begins with S and then an obstruent, if it's a consonant actually, then there are very few possibilities. And if it's a non-continuant, then it only basically is P, T, or K. It can't be B, D, or G, for example. So you can fill in lots and lots of those. Also, you can talk about possible words and impossible words. So Halle talks about thode is a possible but non-existing word, and vnig is an impossible word. Later on, he talks about blick as a non-existing word, but it turns out it's in dictionaries. So sometimes you wish that Halle had looked more in the dictionary for the words that he says are not actual words. Greenberg and Jenkins also addressed these relations between possible and impossible words. And John O'Halla, in a later paper, said he thought they did a better job than Chomsky and Halle of describing what the phonological distance from existing words would be for certain possible words. Part 5, we turn to Pig Latin. And of course, Halle says you'd need just one word, and you don't compare surface forms because that will get you garbage. You just won't see what's really going on. So it's wrong to hug the phonetic ground. You should have a rule. I would point out that I've used Pig Latin in class assignments once because Chipotle had a whole bag for chips, I believe it was, in Pig Latin. I'm not quite sure why, but they did that. And it turns out there are different dialects. What do you do with eat? Is it eat a, eat yay, eat way? There are different possibilities that Halle doesn't seem to know about. Part 6 is dialectal vowel shifting phenomena, the so-called Canadian raising, where you have knife and house versus knives and houses, depending on whether a voiceless or voice segment follows. And when you have flapping, then there are different possibilities. And Halle says, you just need two different orderings of the rules. You can have the same rule in different order, same rules in different orders, and life is great. Children's use of a new rule, Halle says, is often simplified vis-a-vis an adult form. So he's got child language in there, not surprising. And he talks about where new rules would be added and says it would be easiest if they're added at the end of a derivation. So the locus of rule addition should be as the last rule. And then he trashes Hockett because Hockett has a famous place where he says, if you're talking about rules applying in an order, I don't understand what that is unless it's historical. So Bloomfield is progressive because he has ordered rules in his menominee morphophonemics, but Hockett, I think, is unfairly trashed there. So you have progressive Bloomfield and reactionary Hockett, in Halle's opinion. Sound changes like Grimm's and Werner's law are in part 9, ordering phonological rules. Here we have specific examples where they can be stated more simply. Halle says, look, I can play with the big boys on the big changes and deal with them, not just abstract examples. Although then he has a hypothetical example later on. But in part 10, he says sometimes a rule is inserted in the middle of a list of rules, and he has an alleged Middle English example. The Middle English has come in for criticism a lot in the many years since then. He mentions Russian dialects where here, this is very ominous, simplicity considerations lead you to maintain distinct representations of segment types that never contrast phonetically. There's going to be some neutralization on the surface, but he says you need to keep them apart underlyingly. So let me finish the last part, and I'll come back to this other ominous question with the later ominous issue. Phoneme types that merge at one stage may correspond precisely to their historical antecedents and reemerge. So he says not only can you have neutralization, but you can have then loss of the rule and the things that you have been keeping apart, partly for this reason, will then show up again. This has been really criticized and seems not to be common in any case. If this were happening, we would maybe think that should turn into an everywhere as a possibility. You could say, well, all right, maybe a reduced form, an article determiner shouldn't be that way. But Halle is getting into abstract issues of abstractness that were criticized later on. All right, so neutralization and is it absolute or not is going to come up in the later discussion. Halle, in general, is partly overlapping with his sound pattern of Russian from 1959 and an earlier paper at the LSA in 1957. The post-Bloomfieldian American structuralists tended to want to distinguish levels, and since they had a morphophoneme to phonemic level and an autonomous or taxonomic phonemic level to allophonic level, they had to split processes in two, even if they were both voicing rules. So Halle was talking about various Russian outputs of a rule that is assimilating voicing to a following segment. And some of them, things that assimilate aren't phonemes, so those have to be allophonic, and some of them are phonemes, so there's a morphophonemic change that's going on, one phoneme into another, and he has to split rules. Breaking down features in this way of Halle are saying, look, it's all just features underlyingly and features along the way as the rules apply to features on the surface. It's features all the way up and down. That's unified, and you don't have to split the rule into two parts. So we are going against the division into levels in an absolute way. And then Kaparsky and lexical phonology came along and said, actually, there are different grammatical levels, actually, and the rules can be in different places. The same rule is in the different levels, but that's not called a lost generalization anymore. And I am reminded that Raimo Antila was especially unhappy about this kind of thing, where it's almost as if the history of linguistics is a phonological derivation. You get rid of something you don't like, and then you epenthesize it later after you've trashed the people who had it. So Kaparsky never apologized for the levels being resurrected to a certain extent. So Kaparsky also resurrected lexical underspecification because it turns out that Halle had it, the sound pattern of English had it, and in the middle of a chapter, sound pattern of English, which took years and years to come out, was affected by a paper by Richard Stanley on redundancy rules in phonology, and said we have to have full specification and redundancy rules, not underspecification. The kind of thing that Stanley pointed out was, imagine that you have voicing shared by adjacent consonants, say obstruents. So you'll have b, d, and p, k. So you say, oh, I'll take all the voicing information out. Well, then each of them is zero voice, and you don't know which one is voiced and which one is voiceless. It may remind you of the story of British people fearing a German invasion in World War II, who took all the signs away, and then they say, oh, how do we get home? Because the signs weren't there to show them where to go. So Stanley said you needed to have voice and voiceless underlyingly, because if you took all the information out, you wouldn't know what was voiced and what was voiceless. But underspecification does have a good evidence for it from, for example, Greenberg and Jenkins' paper. People say that P, T, and K are farther apart than B, D, and G to each other, and and. So the more they actually shared in terms of explicit features, like plus voice or plus nasal, or plus voice and plus nasal, that makes them seem similar, whereas sharing voicelessness does not seem like a real property that makes them shared. On the other hand, if you take out the redundancy, you get what is shown here with a matrix from the sound pattern of English. This is the English word stun, and you will see basically there are four, okay, so they're all marked because they're segments and not silence. But beyond that, you only have four features. And this is, so all you have to do is say that you've got a T, and it's marked vocalic, so it's a consonant. And then that will tell you that that's an S, and you don't need any other features. And giving you plus back there because it's schwa-like will give you the and then the marked nasal is M rather than N. And if you look at that, well, you can win money from people. Ask them what that word is without telling them, and bet them that they can't do it in 5 minutes or whatever, 30 seconds, and they can't. So there is actually some psycholinguistic research that bears on this, that if your lexicon is like that, it's harder to remember things, and it's harder to show relations between things if you removed all the redundancy. Various people, Paul Hopper, were talking about emergent grammar. This is detergent grammar, where you wash out, as if with bleach or soap, all of the features that you can, and there's very little that's left. Okay, so Halle is fixated on saving features, and in rules and lexical representations. Is Halle actually being kind to children? If you are not like Halle, are you engaging in child abuse to make children memorize more features than you need to? Or are you insulting the intelligence of children? And There is a law of linguist change. Not only are there laws of linguistic change, but concrete phonologists tend to become morphologized. So I'm a person that underwent this change. Steve Anderson, Joan Bybee, and when Kaparsky, when he was concrete, became morphological, and then went back to being phonological when he became abstract. But if you do morphology, you run into, for example, the Arapeshan languages of Papua New Guinea, worked on by Lise Dobrin, for example. There are nearly 30 genders which are manipulated by multiple agreement rules. If kids can learn 30 genders and their agreement rules, are they really going to be bothered by having one extra feature in a phonological matrix? So I think that really doesn't seem the way. I think we're insulting the intelligence of children sometimes. But there are people who say, well, simplicity, if it's simpler, you have to go that way. It doesn't matter if children can learn the more complex one. So lexical phonology did not really reduce the nature of abstractness that Halle had introduced. Peter Daniels encouraged me to use this metaphor, which I had. So Pandora's box lets bad things out, but what happens when you let bad things in? So by having rules that allow almost anything to be an abstract underlying representation, that's Pandora backwards, which is, let's see, a Rodnap. So that would be a Rodnap's universe where things, box, where things are brought in and have sometimes bad effects. So in my dissertation, I reductively asked, maybe you can get rid of features everywhere. You just say every underlying form is zero, and then you have semantically triggered features. So zero goes to cat in the environment of plus feline. Maybe you could even do like WH movement that way too, you know, deletion and prothesis. Some of the gems of abstractness in the sound pattern of English, boy is underlyingly burr. That vowel is found in some Danish dialects, but not very widely otherwise. A front rounded vowel, yes, in English. Divine is divine, as it was in Middle English. Giraffe, this is a wonderful one, is giraffe. And then various rules will reduce the unstressed vowels or front them and degeminate, and the stress is in the right place. And then righteous shouldn't be righteous, it should be riches because of trisyllabic laxing. So Chomsky and Halle put in a velar fricative consonant into modern English to make that come out right. Kaparsky, when he was concrete, attacked this. He said, well, you really need something to justify these radical divergences between surface and underlying forms. And I haven't read this from him, but I was told that he said, this is like Pinocchio's nose. It gets longer when he lies, and your derivation gets longer when you're sort of lying about a hyper-abstract underlying form. So yes, there could be very long derivations. In Chomsky's syntactic structures, he says, in my morphophonemics of modern Hebrew, I have very long derivations, and he's very proud of that. But Halle doesn't really say how you justify a rule. Kaparsky said alternations, although he later backed off this. James Macaulay had the following wonderful test case. In Golden Age Spanish, it was Quixote with a sh. That's why it's Quichotte in French and in German, becomes Quixote in modern Spanish, and is borrowed into English as Quixote or Quixote, based on the spelling and some knowledge of Spanish. But what is the adjective for something like Don Quixote? Quixotic. So, well, this could justify two rules. K becomes qua in the environment of Quixotic, and H becomes xa in the environment of Quixotic. And if you believe that, I have a large tower in a nearby city that I would like to sell you. Halle justifies phonological rules by invoking language games like Pig Latin, but there's severe problems here. Charles Ferguson, who was my teacher, he'll come up later, and in his simplified registers in linguistic theory, he points out that first, Pig Latin is a speech disguise that is supposed to reduce comprehensibility. And second, not everyone can undo the rules and understand it. There's a lot of ideological variation too. But the most amazing evidence is that people don't have equal facility in language game rules. This is not like, for example, aspiration or flapping. Have you ever heard anyone say, oh, you should hear John aspirate, it's just so beautiful. Or, oh, Karen, she flaps like you wouldn't believe. It's just, oh, it's a joy. No, people don't do that. But Katya Zubritskaya, a graduate student at Penn at the time, later in various places, paid two Russian-speaking identical twins to play a language game for 6 hours. They said, we're in America now, you have to pay us. And one could really do the game and the other one couldn't. Mainly they insulted each other. I remember one of them said, you are a tailless donkey. And the other one said, why tailless? And they said, okay, you may have a tail. And it went on like this. But one of them was really good and one of them was not. And they were identical twins. This should not happen if these rules are like regular, normal rules. All right, what about psychological reality? Chomsky and Halle confessed in the sound pattern of English, if language acquisition were instantaneous, then our model would be psychologically real. So if you acquired all the words of English at the same time, then there are rules which have alternations underlying them and some not, would be real. But Macaulay, for example, also pointed out elsewhere, what if you set up underlying forms early on and then you just keep those even when other data come on later? I mean, we have this in our beliefs. Sometimes we have a belief when we're young and it's sort of hard to bring in other facts and get rid of that first one. So what kind of thing is at issue here? James Harris's 1969 book on Spanish phonology said that the underlying form for milk in Spanish, leche, is lacte. Why is that? Because of the existence of lactar, to lactate, and lactico, lactic. So these are not words that are heard, or at least heard often enough, by young children. Remember another case, Harris had cocer in the New World Spanish, to cook, and then cocción, which has a cook, has K in there, and underlyingly has cocer for to cook. I remember asking a friend, when did you learn the word cocción? He said, oh, in high school. So if you're learning certain words in high school, how are they really going to affect your underlying form? Are you going to really go back and say, wait a minute, I want lacte now because I've learned lactar and lactico. With dialects, there are similar problems. Peter Treadgill pointed out that people have all sorts of knowledge of their dialect and not other dialects. So if you try to set up one set of underlying forms for all the dialects, you're not going to be able to do that because you're going to need a lexical representation for every dialect where you can put the exceptional features there. If they have slightly different meanings, if they have slightly different connotations, then you're going to need to put the underlying form in each dialect. And would it really be so terrible to have a different phoneme in that dialect? And of course, Lebov basically has shown that there is tremendous dialect variation, not all of which can be done by systematic rules with polylectal grammars. The grammars are for the social dialects, not overall for the language. But Chomsky, you can't believe he said this, but he has a book where he was interviewed in French and answered in French, and then it was translated. And then the French original was lost. So it's a complicated book, but he compares, Mitsuo now is trying to get him to say Lebov has done important work, for example, on African-American English. And he says, oh, you can collect butterflies if you want. So he compared sociolinguistics to butterfly collecting, not really interested in the dialectological details. Okay, so over time, do we think that the rules that Halle talks about give a good account of rules of pronunciation, changes in pronunciation? Henning Anderson has pointed out that really what most people are talking about is diachronic correspondences. I mean, anything of 100 years or more, you're talking about diachronic correspondences. In classical Armenian, the word for two, dwos in Indo-European, and this is first attested in 500 Common Era, is yerku. So you go from dwos to yerku. Again, you should not think that that is one change, but a series of changes. So Halle is not really saying whether he's dealing with diachronic correspondences or actual changes. All right, so the loss I've already mentioned, you would not expect to turn into an. And here the thing is that change over time probably leads to more than one underlying form for a single item. For /an, you will have and an, and the main one is probably So this is like what Macaulay suggested, that language change is probably giving us something which is not derivable from all the other forms. A parallel example in Catalan, so the word for good is bo, but for good, that's masculine singular. For feminine plural, you'll have bonus. The usual way is to put an N even in the masculine and delete it, but why not have the one form that is the unmarked one as the underlying form, and the other ones are parallel underlying forms. Basically, the rule is you should not use a marked form for crucial evidence as to the underlying form. So Halle's program for generative phonology laid out what people would be doing for decades. And Michael Kenstowitz's 1994 book is called Phonology and Generative Grammar. But bizarrely, he does not give Halle credit for that title. I don't understand why, but that term is still out there. So what came after Halle? A virtual industry concerned with rule application and rule ordering. Is it stipulated? Is it universally determined? Can rules apply simultaneously, or are they sequential? Can the same rule reapply? Or is there local ordering? I think people have not paid much attention to that, as they should have. That was Steve Anderson's idea, that the ordering of rules depends on what forms are involved, not some absolute. Many, many possibilities for rule ordering. And there are ever-changing analyses of certain chestnuts. Upside-down phonology, those were my teachers, Will Laban and Rob Robinson, said it should go backwards. You should have surface forms and derive them. Caprice, capricious, you would expect caprice, capricious. Obese, obesity, you would expect obese, obesity. Given able, ability, and unable, you would expect unability, but it's inability. So these are problems for features. Do you do a certain amount of derivation and then apply a phonological rule, or should you do the wrong thing and then clean it up? We've already had Quixote and quixotic, and some of the time you get to laugh. So Arthur Abramson pointed out suppose, suppository as an alternation that you could talk about. So I would like to say thank you to our cher maître, Maurice Halle, for directing our attention to Morris and the matrix and to Halle and rules. They can be edifying and entertaining. And so here are some finally examples of matrices and rules. So Chomsky and Halle, this is Halle's. He has a two-part analysis of English vowel shift, where first you take high vowels and lower them, and then you take mid vowels. Sorry, you take high vowels and make them mid, and then you have mid vowels and you make them low, and that gives you E to I and U to ow. And Steve Anderson said Halle knew that you could do it a different way, but he thought this was cute, I quote. In my dissertation and some earlier work, I found you could do this with one rule, although the interpretation of the Greek letter variables and the positives and negatives is not very straightforward, but it works as one rule, and it's got fewer features than Halle's rule. All right, so we conclude with humor, because Halle was a mensch and he loved humor. If you know the genre of jokes, Radio Yerevan jokes, I would be happy to give you one. I know that he loved those, and here was something that he enjoyed in the Macaulay Festschrift. I believe it's either his 38th or Macaulay, I believe, was born in 38, so it's either 30th or 31st birthday. No, would that work? No. Well, yeah, because he would have been 69, so just after his 30th or 31st birthday, he published early, Studies Out in Left Field. So Journal of the Debating Society of America rather than the Linguistic Society of America. And these people, the first article is by Maurice Halle, and the title is in features, all features. It has 7 matrices, and then says the title is continued over the next 3 pages. I will tell you what it is. I was going to make you guess because I think Halle would want you to do that, but there seems to be a typo in it. It's got a Canadian or a British accent. So it's on, with the low back rounded vowel, and it should be simple, but the vowel is wrong. It actually has a high back unrounded vowel, which even Halle I don't think would want here. So there's a plus grave that should be minus grave, so it's unrounded. But that is an indirect reference to a paper by Halle earlier on the role of simplicity in linguistic description. So this is probably on simplicity, but it doesn't even get to the first 2 words on the first page. So Morris has got us focused on matrices and rules. The theory followed him. He is a founder and pioneer, and he's carved out trails. And even when things go wrong, they are still responding to him. So I would be happy to say some personal things about him as a as a teacher and as a researcher, but I want to establish my bona fides to tell you that I really am in France. So here I have a baguette and a real beret to show you that, yes, I am in France. So thank you very much for listening, and I would be happy to entertain your comments.
Thank you so much, Richard, for this very entertaining and informative synopsis of this work. And I see questions coming up, remarks very quickly. So I will take Kathleen. I think that you're the first one. Please go ahead.
Thanks. This will be quick. I just was wondering, does any evidence support or have people proposed that the A article in English is actually not the underlying form, but the an is probably the underlying form with the n deleted before another consonant, especially if we consider almost all of the Romance and Germanic languages have ein or an or un, etc. in the in the form, the basic form of that definite article. Thanks.
I believe I've seen one such analysis, but it doesn't really make sense. A linguist who became a judge and then wrote about linguistics again, and the Marx Brothers humor, Peter Tiersma, who had a dissertation from UC San Diego and worked on analogy, among other things, played a game for a class paper. He got Scrabble tiles and then played fish, and they had to ask for the letters. And of course, a lot of the letters begin with vowels. And almost all of the children, I believe these were even under, say, 8 years, they would say things like, do you have a A? Do you have a E? So they were underusing an as far as quote unquote standard English is concerned. But there's certainly the Catalan one, again, where bo becomes, it comes from bon. There is a real tendency, would you put your money on an N to survive in a language in final position? Dutch, for example, is losing n in plurals as they speak.
Well, losing it is fine, but I'm saying to assume that it wasn't the first form and it becomes reduced other than added.
Well, I'm only saying that
it does.
Because you have both of them, that a generativist will want to put an as the underlying form and delete it. That's not historical as a synchronic analysis.
Got it. Okay, sorry. Okay, thanks.
Because there's no doubt that it was there historically, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, Peter, you're next.
Let Raul go first.
Sure. Thanks, Raul. Yeah.
Sure. So 2 quick remarks. One is one of my teachers at UC San Diego was Sandy Shane, who, of course, did his whole, generative analysis of French as a historical reconstruction back to early French. So my question about that is, if we're sending everything back to like Latin, right? There's the assumption that Latin was perfect in its structure, that it didn't have irregularities or any issues with its morphology, which is probably false, right? So if Halle had been born in like ancient Rome, what would he have done as the morphophonology or the phonological matrix for Latin?
Yeah, I'm sure you're right about that. I even have a Latin poem for you as former president of Nahals, but I've been writing elegiac distichs and having to deal with, you only need about 15 words and 30 syllables, so it's very limited. But seeing all the irregularity there is in the morphology, the genitives that, US forms that are, us forms that are feminine, and things that are one gender in the singular and another in the plural. This all reminds me of a Dutch linguist, David Lightfoot quoted him. Cornelis Ebeling, there's a book, Linguistic Units, and Ebeling principle named by Lightfoot says, Ebeling says, well, I'm Dutch and I don't know English, so when I look at English, it's terrifically clear to me how I should analyze it, and yet I find all these discussions of different possibilities. With Dutch, though, I see all these possibilities, and I don't think it's clear at all. So if a Tabata Labal Indian learns generative linguistics, then probably that Indian will see all sorts of possibilities. So whatever it is you don't know well seems very straightforward to you. And what you do know seems very complicated. And we can't all be that multilingual. But I mean, Halle spoke so many languages, Yiddish and Latvian and Russian. And so I really wonder if he and Jakobson spoke Russian to each other, for example, a lot of the time. But how you get, I hate to say this, but in some ways, in his analyses, he doesn't have Sprachgefühl. He just sort of does it mechanically and tries to say features. And somehow you have a feeling about a language, even if you're not a native speaker sometimes, of how much complexity there is. And is it disrespectful not to have the complexity? But Halle would say, again, maybe you're engaging in child abuse because you're making these Latin-speaking children have too many exceptions to worry about. You had another?
I'll let Peter go first, and if there's nobody
Okay.
else, I'll go back to my second question.
Well, I've been waiting 51 years to share this Macaulayism. Picture it, 1974, summer meeting of the LSA in Amherst. Somehow Chomsky was a plenary speaker. He'd had nothing to do with the LSA already for 2 decades. And I happened to be sitting with Jim Macaulay in the audience, and he stood up. I don't know what point he was making against Chomsky, but he came up with the pairs moth, mother, cough, cover, boss, buzzer. And obviously these are connected by a phonological rule. And I don't think he ever wrote that down anywhere, but I love those examples. And the other thing is, maybe you should turn off the recorder right now, but I was talking with Hockett after we'd reconnected, and he knew I was into writing systems and he had written about writing, and that was why he sent me the articles that I edited for Written Language and Literacy. I had been through Sound Pattern of Russian, and I mentioned that Halle threw out the phonemic baby with the orthographic bathwater. And Hockett said, Halle is very stupid, using exactly that word. And I wonder if you have a reaction.
Jakobson trashed Traeger's Russian grammar that he had done for the army because he was mad at what Traeger had said about him otherwise. And catching up with something else, Michael Silverstein said that Norman McQuown had shown him the signed dollar bill, that it still existed. So maybe it was never given to Jakobson, and also said that it was partly anti-Semitic. So Jakobson got a bad rap, even though he was could be arrogant. And he also was said, someone said he spoke Russian in 8 different languages, that he could lecture in spontaneously. But the sound pattern of Russian, it has certain theoretical axes to grind, and Halle never stopped grinding. But at the Macaulay example, Bruce Derwing was at the University of Alberta, I believe, for a long time, and sort of went almost too far about generative grammar being all wrong. But he did an experiment, it might have been with Gary Prideaux, the psycholinguist, where they gave people words and had them rate their relatedness. And they said that, for example, one of them I remember is COST, cost, and caustic, CAUSTIC, have nothing to do with each other morphologically. They were very close. They said they were related words. So they were going by the sound much more than by morphological relation. So you wonder what they would have done with divine divinity. And Macaulay did an experiment. He has a paper called Where You Can Shove Affixes, where he gave people words to stick. I'll say bloody. He had the F word. And they did really amazing things with evidence for ambisyllabicity. So he used the word, I think, manor, M-A-N-O-R, where there's only one N in the spelling. And they would say man, bloody, ner. So there was an N at the end of the first syllable and at the beginning of the second syllable. So it's as if they had ambisyllabicity, stuck bloody in the middle and got 2 N's. And that's not the usual pattern. That's not the usual pattern.
Kwang Fuk Dang?
No, it was in Syllables and Segments, the paper by Alan Bell and Hooper. where you can shove affixes is in that volume. But he had the Quang Vc Dung is I'm not going to say filthier. It's just less safe for work.
Well, this has definitely been yeah, both enlightening and very entertaining. I appreciate the all the humoristic anecdotes as well. I mean, some of these paper titles are fantastic. So both of the talks this session had really enjoyable titles. So thank you both so much. It's 2:37. I think that we'll have time after this towards the end of the sessions also to continue discussion. But perhaps if anyone would like to take a break before the 2:45 session, this is surely a good time. It doesn't mean everyone who's still connected can't keep talking. But thank you guys so much. And Sheila, I think that are you the co-host for next session? I don't know if you're there at this moment.
Yeah,
Okay, great.
I'm here.
I'll still be here. But I'll pass the buck to Sheila for helping move things along.
Okay.
Thank you.
Does anyone remember how long Hackett kept going to Lakis meetings? Because my first one was in 93 in Ann
Yeah.
Arbor.
I don't really remember how long. I mean, I remember from the 80s and the 90s, but I don't think not beyond the 90s, I think. So you may have caught one of the last ones.
I only went to 3, Ann Arbor in 93, Chicago in 94. No, Ann Arbor was 91, Chicago 93, and Vancouver 94. And then I wasn't going to go to Arlington, Texas in August, no matter what. And the next one was in some place I never heard of in far northern Quebec. So that was out of the question for flying there from Chicago.
Abitibi-Témiscamingue?
I don't know.
I don't think it was
no.
there. It was
mailing
the
list
Chicoutimi,
they
maybe.
never appeared on
Yeah.
Linguistic.
I don't remember.
Chicoutimi would be.
And then Sidney Lamb said that I didn't go to Lakis meetings anymore because I was mad at Earl Herrick's rebuttal to my grapheme, my grapheme talk in Ann Arbor, but that was nonsense.
William Labov reported that he was called in as some kind of advisor on linguistics programs to Yale. And a dean said to him, this would have been around 66, 68. The dean said to Labov, Sidney Lamb and Noam Chomsky, I don't think either of these young men has proven himself yet, do you?
I just pulled up a list of all the Lakis conferences. I'm trying to see where your so-called far northern Quebec might be.
Chicoutimi is not really that far north.
No, because
There was
the only
one in Waterloo.
Should be
Yeah,
The only
there was
one-
one in Waterloo.
the only one I can think of is 1983 here, Université Laval, but that's Quebec City and hardly the far north.
It would have been the 96 one.
96. 96, Brigham Young.
Really? 2 Americans in a row.
96. Yeah, occasionally there were 2 in a row, and there have been several in a row in Canada now. There's Université du Québec à Montréal, 92, and again 2001. Not seeing any
Wouldn't
far
have had a
northern.
problem with BYU.
Yeah, there was
Maybe-
one at BYU. I was not there.
Maybe it changed after they sent the initial invitation because no one responded.
No, this is the list of what actually did happen.
Yeah,
Okay, yeah, I don't know.
So they could be near a lake as long as it's a lake. So Salt Lake is okay.
Well, it had to branch out. You know, like Vancouver, that's an even bigger lake, but
A bay is kind of like a lake that's open at both ends.
Vancouver has changed immensely since the first time I was there in 75 and the second time in 94, because everyone had moved from Hong Kong to Vancouver
Uh,
because they knew they were about to be seeded.
yeah.
And the whole mountain to the north of the city was now covered with luxury high-rise apartments.
oh, in North End, yeah.
In
It used to
99,
be a forested mountain.
too bad. In 1999, Itchell was in Vancouver.
Yes.
Well, it was at UBC. And
Right.
there were some Icelanders there. And one of the excursions, or I think maybe one afternoon, was to a kind of SeaWorld-like place where there was a whale show. And they were telling about the whales. And they said, this whale was captured near Iceland. Um, and are there any Icelanders here? Expecting nobody. And about 5 people raised their hands. And they said, oh, what do you eat in Iceland? And they said, whales. That was the fastest change of topic I've ever seen in a show, a SeaWorld type place.